the south and the north, from where I'm from in Canada, but also the US, Colombia, Argentina, Hungary, Russia, Egypt, Kenya, South Africa, India, Israel. And so we work on a global level dealing with human rights. And a major topic that we've taken on recently is privacy, and particularly how privacy has evolved over the last few decades and the different kinds of rights and problems that it brings up. So we advocate transnationally on this issue. We do educational seminars, but we also sue governments, reach out to intelligence agencies, lobby policymakers, and a whole host of things. So what I'd like to do, just to start this topic off and sort of to get an idea of where everyone stands on the right to privacy, is I'd like to introduce what, for the room, may or may not be a controversial statement. And so the statement is, privacy has a different meaning online than off. And what I'd like to do is, I don't know if there's been a lot of chatting with yourselves, but I'd like everyone at each table to look at that sentence, answer, reach a consensus as to whether that's a yes or a no, and then give a brief statement as to why. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to talk about that, and then we'll touch base again.
Yeah, that's with a good intention. You can evaluate.
You could do the same thing. Yes, the intention is okay. Once it's there, it's there. Yeah, it should be said that it's
Ideally, it should be the same, but in reality, it's not. You don't have control over online data. It's once it's up, it's out of your
You have a clear answer now based on this discussion?
If you search for any watch, you're looking for an online watch, the rest of the month you will get start popping up all the
What do you think I'll do is a better
research.
stand up when it comes to each table.
More and more search on Google or other search engines, making your search very efficient every time you get very similar.
Okay, everyone. So we've had a few minutes to chat about what is clearly not a simple or straightforward sentence. And what I'd like everyone to do is I'll walk around the room, and if one person from each table can sort of stand up and give consensus, if any, from your talk, that would be grand. Thank you. Who from this table would like to start?
I suppose firstly our discussion, it really came about interpretation of this sentence in line with what we would like, ideology of how we would like privacy, because initially we had a yes, one of us said yes, one of us said no, compared to what's currently going on. So we would like privacy online to mean privacy like you close the door in a room and you have a conversation, but what is currently going on. So we thought there was basically two interpretations of that statement, and we also identified very quickly that we believe privacy is a human right, and that online we give away privacy maybe far more easily by just clicking the OK button and clicking the done button and not reading the terms and conditions. So they were just some initial brainstorming ideas anyway we had.
Thank you, that's great. Who from this table?
Okay, so we just discussed that while it should be the same, it's not the same, and then we talked about things like scraping the web for data. While the intention of scraping might be good, that's somebody else's data that you're scraping or information that you're looking for. We had a couple examples of that, and even down to when, you know, TripAdvisor gives you suggestions of where you should eat just because they know how you're going on holidays. You didn't post it anywhere, but you booked your flights online, and you might have looked and booked things, and yeah, so it isn't private. Whether that will change or not remains to be seen.
Have you ever taken TripAdvisor's suggestions?
Yeah.
By the way, I know you'll be in Dublin on Wednesday. Why don't you go to the Cobble Street?
Yeah, we said that privacy has a different meaning online than off. We were looking at basically what we were talking about. Yeah, so we were talking about the digital footprint. So everything you do online is recorded. Everything from if you had I was given an example of a night out, and you wake up the next morning and Google Maps tells you where you were, exactly when you were, down to the minute. So if you stopped off for a burger on the way home, you can. There's a record of that. It's very hard to delete information online. So. Yeah, different than a private conversation where if you have a conversation with somebody 20 years later, they will have forgotten. If you have the conversation online, there's the record of it.
Does it tell you if you fell asleep in the gutter? There's a half an hour difference between where I was and where I was. So I just assume I fell asleep in the gutter.
Okay, we just came up with this, a couple of thoughts rather than I think a consensus on it. We felt that it was easier to have to share online, kind of I suppose consciously and unconsciously. At the other end of the spectrum, then we felt that sometimes we would actually be more reluctant to share online. So it was kind of I suppose a mix there. In relation to I suppose kind of inadvertent privacy breaches around how data can be gathered and analysed online, often unbeknownst to us. That was another point that came up. I suppose the overall point was that there was a greater vulnerability to privacy being breached online. And then the other point was that breaches of privacy online are far more wide-reaching, whereas breach of privacy may involve one or more people if it's face-to-face, but it could potentially be hundreds and thousands and even, I guess, millions if there's a breach online. Is there anything else?
Just the point about privacy. What do you mean by privacy? Yeah. That was kind of there. Yeah.
So that's a good point. I'll address that. Does anyone here have a stronger public speaking voice than I do to speak without the mic? It died.
We can hear you actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
you can hear you.
Okay. We actually were fighting a lot to say yes or no. We decided it's a very complex question, And we wanted to know what is privacy, actually, what is online as well, we weren't sure, and who is it targeting, who is it for Generation Z or Z, or is it for us as an educator? Very complex, so we started fighting and
Right, so you educate in an educational sphere that requires critical thinking. I'll take that question and I'll return it to you with 5 more questions. There we go. Would you like the mic? Give a final word.
I think we had a mix of views, and I think probably echoing a lot of the points that have already been made, and I suppose the first that it's almost contradictory putting privacy and online together, because I think we all sort of output in our conversation that, as soon as you go online, you can pretty much give up the idea of privacy, because you are, no matter how much you lock down and safeguard against your digital footprint, which organize, which is what you have to give up some of it. You buy a smartphone, you buy
No, and that's a very good point. I think it's fair to say that we should accept that privacy is not something that we can rely on when we go online. And the point that was made initially is, so there's this concept of privacy, and the experience of it may differ when you're having a private conversation on the street than when you're having that conversation online. And then there's that question of what, in fact, is privacy. And I'll answer that question by saying, first of all, privacy is a static definition. So even though we may experience it differently online than off, its meaning and its value is ultimately the same. And as someone said, it is a human right. And it serves as the foundation around what a lot of our other human rights are built. So it's essential to our notions of self, it's essential to our notions of dignity, and it creates this sort of ideological barrier that prevents encroachments into our personal space. In privacy, it helps us limit who has access not only to our bodies, but to our places and our things, and it also limits who has access to our communications and our information. It's an essential way to protect ourselves against arbitrary and unjustly exercised forms of power. It reduces what can be known about us and done to us, while protecting us from others who wish to exert control on us. It's essential to who we are as human beings, and it's essential to the kinds of decisions that we make every single day. And as everyone has identified very well in this classroom, increasingly in our online world, we aren't being informed about the monitoring that we're being placed under. Someone mentioned, several people mentioned, you can do something in one area and the computer just somehow magically knows. It knows where you're going, what you're doing, and who you're talking to. That level of knowledge about our daily interactions is a form of privacy invasion that has come out in the last 10 years through the increased use of technology. Secret surveillance of people has been an issue since the Second World War, but the way it's done now has been done in a way that's very technically sophisticated and prevents us not only from being aware of it, but also prevents laws from responding to and adequately controlling how surveillance is done. And indeed, the types of surveillance that are done on us are often actually used by legal officials themselves. But it's not just government officials that do it, it's private entities as well. So I'd like to reiterate a few basic principles on our fundamental privacy rights. These exist absolutely. They are often compromised, but it doesn't change the fact that these are principles that exist not just in the non-virtual world, but online as well. There are principles that are derived from international human rights norms, and also here in Europe from the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights. So privacy is not absolute. Can anyone think of a reason why our privacy might be rightfully invaded?
You might have the potential to know where how many phone is, and I'm going to detonate it, and I'm going to know more access to that information.
So reasons of state security.
Yeah.
Then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Criminal.
Yes. So to prevent the occurrence or to detect a potential crime, that might be another reason.
The trouble with that is who determines what the crime.
That's a good point. I mean, most states have criminal codes that define criminal activity, so it would be maybe to detect those sorts of crimes.
Yeah,
Are there other reasons?
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
When president Assad, what I deem to be a crime.
Right, okay. Well, so that's a good point. There are state laws that say what crimes are, and then there are international human rights norms that sometimes push against and invalidate what those states' laws say. But if you are going to invade someone's privacy for some of the reasons that we've listed, the agreed principles on an international level are that you need to have a legal reason to do it, and even that law needs to have a legitimate aim, like maybe detecting a serious crime or protecting the public. And even then, it needs to be necessary. You need to be able to find that information a certain way. You need to be able to do that only because there's no other way to find out. And even then, if you go in and you do actually invade someone's privacy, it needs to be proportionate. There needs to be, the risk is so severe that it needs to outweigh people's fundamental rights to privacy. And even then, you need to have people adequately overseeing what's happening and what you're doing to ensure that that privacy right isn't being invaded unnecessarily. And then, most importantly, there needs to be user notification and, in some cases, consent. So I teach a human rights course at UCB, and really smart kids. I think they are maybe in that Generation Z population that we're discussing. And I said to them, you know, we're being surveilled. What are your thoughts on this? Are you worried? And I would say that they are generally ambivalent about it. They don't seem to mind. They pointed me to this this meme that started going around in 2007. Has anyone seen this? It's about the friendly FBI agent. So this is the first person, Indy, who started it. And so we've got our computers with our webcams. And she goes, me, I cover my camera from my laptop's webcam with the tape. And the government agent, who's always watching me inside, says, what? Are you mad at me? What's the problem? And here's another example. Me, peeling the tape off my webcam. It's about a student studying. Hey guys, what does apoptosis mean? A little FBI voice within my computer. It's programmed cell death. Me, thanks Roger, tell the family happy holidays. Roger the FBI man, will do, please get more sleep, you're staying up too late. So, I really like the comments here. Someone's like, oh, by the way, you don't need to take the tape off your webcam, your mic is always on. And then someone's like, well, yeah, I know, but it's an extra personal touch to be able to say that face to face. So I brought this slide up, not knowing, we're not looking closely enough at what other folks are talking about. And I won't get into serious detail, but can anyone tell me quickly what a digital footprint is? Someone actually used the term. Does anyone need a mic? Your trace.
The train behind.
Who wants the mic? That's it.
Your trace, what you leave behind.
Trace of what?
Activity.
Yeah.
Of you.
Does it include digital shadow? Is that in the sense that?
Ooh, digital shadow.
You're disturbed in the sense that it's not potentially say Googleable, but there is a digital trace, but it's in the shadow.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it does leave a shadow, and it certainly does leave a trail. It specifically includes the websites that you visit, the emails that you send, and the information that you submit to online services. And it's worth noting that there's a difference between active and passive digital footprints. Someone else used a different set of terms. Active is when you're putting yourself out there and creating a trail of your activities online. Passive digital footprints are the data trails that you unintentionally leave online. And unfortunately, this is the situation in the educational context. So research shows that parents have lost track of their child's digital footprint in school by their 5th birthday. And before a child has left a primary school, their personal data has commonly been sent to over 10 commercial companies without a parent's knowledge. And often this data is further shared onward after processing with many apps and platform partner affiliates who go on to use the data for profiling behavior or for product marketing purposes. And despite this distribution of data, there is a perception of trust and benevolent oversight within educational institutes. So much like that friendly FBI guy who's in your webcam, there's this understanding that there's this high level of trust given to educational institutions to use private data of their students very well. And so thus, by the time kids reach the university level, there's become this culture of acceptance of surveillance, a culture of acceptance with respect to data harvesting, and this idea that your privacy no longer exists online becomes effectively normalized. Despite this normalized culture, digital privacy advocates are working very hard to establish protections against this broad accessing and distribution of confidential personal data in contexts that include educational institutions. So the International Working Group on Data Protection said in 2017 that the sensitivity of student data should not be underestimated. Legislation covering educational institutions may not adequately address new technological trends in learning processes. And there's an extended scope and purpose of data processing in the context of e-learning and learning analytics. And governments are attempting to set out ways to give people more control over their personal data through various data protection laws on both domestic levels and also through the European regulations. So we're finding domestically, particularly in Ireland, unfortunately, that the data protection laws are being formulated poorly. In Ireland, there are bills overseeing data retention and protection, together with data sharing and governance, and they've all been roundly criticized by local data privacy experts, including me, including my employer, for failing to comply with EU laws and also with international human rights norms. The EU General Data Protection Regulation, however, has shown a very high standard of protection. It gives people more control over their personal data, and it also helps to protect students online. Despite this high standard, it's a very new regulation, and we remain concerned about the level of compliance with this brand new regulation. The GDPR is arguably, it's probably the most complex piece of legislation that the EU has ever produced. It's very extensive, it has 99 articles. The problem is, places like educational institutes, they themselves have trouble complying with the regulation, at least at this stage of the game, but also understanding that whether or not the third-party online companies that they interact with, if they're adequately complying as well. So I'm going to talk about some of the effects of how our privacy is influenced within educational contexts with respect to sort of online processes here. Is there anyone in the room that does not interact regularly with Blackboard? Okay. Do you know what Blackboard is?
I do. No,
Yeah.
we have a different, it's Moodle.
Moodle, okay.
Yeah.
So similar. Okay. So when we consider profiling, we can consider how Blackboard is implicated. Profiling in an online context, do we all understand what that means? Yeah?
Oh, brilliant.
I nodded way too quickly there. Profiling is like categorizing or grouping groups of people together based on their age, orientations, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very well done. So be careful when you nod. So yeah, it's data available from an existing information source online, which can be coalesced to draw sort of broad pictures about who people are. So a well-known example of student profiling within educational institutes is Blackboard recruitment. And that's MathWorks. People might be able to walk me through this a little because I don't deal with Blackboard and I don't want to say anything with certainty. So I've done some research and I'm going to say this appears to be the situation without indicting Blackboard at this time. But according to its website, Blackboard Analytics allows schools to recruit with more foresight. Instead of treating the beginning of a learner's first year as the end goal, enrollment officers apparently use Blackboard Analytics to determine which students are likely to stay in school, are likely to re-enroll, and are likely to ultimately graduate. By profiling what they call rich historical and demographic indicators, institutions can ensure that prospective students will be a, quote, good fit, unquote, and more likely to succeed. By marketing these students accordingly, colleges and universities will improve student success rates and their own future. So, to me, there's a lot of big warning signs in that statement. I
don't think that's the case. Okay, I don't mean that in a negative sense, but anybody help me here on this one?
I just want to be clear, this is copied and pasted from Blackboard. I've read out what they say.
Okay, what they say.
This is
because they have to register themselves, the students do.
Yeah, so this is what I wanted to walk through.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah,
Blackboard is making these claims about profiling, and they're making claims about the benefits of profiling.
But I actually don't think that, I don't think Blackboard is any different from Canvas or Sakai or Moodle. They all do data analytics. They all do predictive data analytics.
Certainly, yeah, I'm not making a distinction. But I'm just. So we're agreed that it happens, but what you're saying is it's no different from what other companies do as well.
Well, I think the BLEs can do. I'm not saying they all do it, but it can be done. But data analytics is like they'll sell it in terms of it'll help identify students at risk of dropout.
Right.
So it's
so
with you.
You would argue that it increases efficiencies. It maybe saves resources by not investing in problem students.
Data analytics supporters would claim that, yes.
Depends how you use it.
Depends, I don't think it's
I think it could be really problematic because if you start using data and predictive analytics to potentially identify students that may be, okay, there are potential benefits in identifying students who may be at risk, whatever that means. There, you can, obviously resources dependent, provide extra supports, but at the same time, if you're using data to build up patterns and to identify students coming in first year, and by putting a label on them, to put a label on them, for example, as in they are more likely to drop out by the end of this year, that's student identity, in a sense, and that's problematic.
I agree. Do we have any sociologists in the room? Really? Quantitative or qualitative? Did you say quantitative? Qualitative.
That's the devil's work.
Yes. Agreed. Sorry, did anyone else who hasn't spoken want to speak?
So I always thought that the only information on Moodle was the student number because it's supposed to be anonymous. So I'm quite surprised that there would be any other information. So the only way that you could decipher whether a student was going to fail or not is or drop out is because they're failing. Sorry, but that's maybe, I had no idea.
And how they're using it, that's the question.
I think it goes back to what we had in the previous one about having the technology and then the capability of using it. So while the technology itself may have the facility to do that analytics, how it's actually used, depends on who's using it. But it does have the capability to do it.
Exactly, yeah. I can't speak to Moodle simply because I haven't looked at that one. So the problem is the process can be quite opaque. Information is gathered about students, not necessarily with their knowledge or their consent. It's very difficult for a student entering a university to say, you know what, I don't want to use Blackboard. They would really have trouble surviving. So when, under the GDPR, Article 22 provides that as a rule there's generally a prohibition on fully automated individual decision making, including profiling that has a legal or similarly significant effect. And so the problem within an educational context is that it's difficult to be precise about what would be considered sufficiently significant as to meet the threshold that triggers the GDPR. I would say, however, that on the enrollment side, profiling can perpetuate existing stereotypes and social segregation, which I assumed maybe a sociologist would agree with me on that point. Sociologists use the term vertical migration. Individuals, through no fault of their own, tend to be locked into their socioeconomic location, despite these myths of meritocracy, that if you just try really hard and work really hard, you can get a good job and make lots of money. The reality and the research shows that it can be very challenging to rise beyond your class designation. And profiling at the entrance, at the very beginning of a student's career, without their knowledge and consent, I think would very much contribute to that. And when we have systems like Blackboard, so-called information management systems that are actively participating to those stereotypes and biases, that strikes me as very problematic.
I just have a quick question. I don't think I need the mic. Is what you're saying that the GDPR would consider a negative thing? So I know that Loop is very similar to Blackboard, would flag students in our program historically if they would fail 2 or more modules in first year or in the first semester, it would be a flag based on historical data, they will struggle to progress. So I chair one of the degrees and I would be notified of that in a very supportive manner, and it would be to catch those students and give them support so that they don't drop out of the system. But I'm just wondering, from a GDPR point of view, is that a negative thing?
Well, to me, that strikes me as a positive thing. So from a GDPR point of view, you can't profile someone if it has a significantly, I assume, negative impact on their life. So if you were to, again, I don't know Moodle, but if that flag was to say, okay, that student's automatically put on probation and isn't given resources or sufficient support, and then if there was another failure, and then they had to be removed from the program on that basis, that's a data control situation that requires better notification and consent.
Sorry, I'm just on family following the ELSS 18. I have a piece out with Mark Glynn in DCU about learning analytics and Moodle. Just an interesting piece.
Okay.
I just look on the.
Oh, you found a piece related to this?
Oh, I know a guy. Yeah,
okay.
In DCU, and it's Moodle. As I said, that's something to do with Blackboard. All those VLEs can do that.
Okay. I don't know if there's a shared mailing list where that can be distributed after, but that would be interesting to share. So moving.
Hashtag. I put that's where it's gone there. Yeah.
Okay. So moving on, just to looking more generally at applications and third parties. Universities often sign students up for named accounts on dozens of apps for admin or for assignments. Platforms like Google's G Suite in education give students personal email accounts, like Gmail, often with external access, and often enabling social login to social media and other apps. So there's risks involved here. Signing students up to these private third-party accounts results for the students in immediate loss of their autonomy and their privacy rights. Schools export class or even school-wide populations of student data to third parties for named accounts for administrative purposes. So literally in a few clicks, there can be bulk transfers of information at speed of this private data out to third parties, again without the proper notification, knowledge, and consent. This also is a problem with respect to the GDPR because the GDPR really focuses on minimization, minimal data transfer. But when schools engage with these private companies that are interested in harvesting data, those GDPR protections sort of fall to the wayside. So there are several examples that I'd like to give. I'll go through them briefly. Some of them, I'm not sure if I brought in any Irish examples. I apologize for that. Edmodo, does everyone know Edmodo? Yeah. So that's a US-based education platform. It was exposed for targeted ad tracking without notification. So that's one problem. It was later hacked and lost 77 million staff and student records from 550,000 schools worldwide. So a lot of private data held and a lot of private data lost. In this February, a researcher in Australia found that children's identifiable data was publicly available to download from the app Mathletics. Not only did the app harvest personal data, but it also